Très bien, eh bien, nous attaquons. Merci.
So we'll start. Thank you for the online audience. We don't have so many people in the room, but about 300 online. So it's true, it's been a long day at the Palais Brongniart in Paris. This should not deter from being up to the challenge. We have the world listening to us on the network. So thank you for those who came here for this last event of the day. I would like to greet in particular the Under Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, Mr. Li Junhua, who is in particular working at DESA, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. It was my pleasure to work with you in the past when I was head of the Development Committee for the United Nations, and also for the preparation of this vulnerable index, the multi-dimensional index, which was much talked about today at the Palais Brongniart. So thank you. I would like to thank in particular Fatoumata Taba, who is an iconic figure of African entrepreneurship, having beautifully succeeded in what she undertook, not without difficulty, but it's important for the conclusions of our international chair for development architecture. Thank you, Fatima. She's also co-chair of the Digital Conference of FERDI. We have also Daouda Sembène, who came from Senegal, who's a consultant expert with his company in Senegal, but in the past also held some important functions in the state and international institution. In particular, was and still is a member of the Center for International Development, for which we were expecting Masoud Ahmed, but based on the latest information, he was not able to join us. It's a pity because we have very close relationships with his organization, and we're happy to look forward to discuss some conclusions. So this FERDI chair, which we will be discussing the major conclusions of this body. We have a number of members of this chair. Lewerou himself is ill and cannot join us, but Jean-Michel Celerino, Bruno Cadriac, and Olivier Verfeld are present to tell us what are the main conclusions that our organization has come to over the last 6 months. Jean-Michel Celerino, everybody knows him, as we spoke about the chair of FERDI. He is in the international chair for economic development, but he's also involved in another chair that is at FERDI. And Bruno Cabriac, who is hosting us tonight, whom I would like to thank him and Banque de France for mobilizing and booking this beautiful conference room. Now, the purpose of this evening's event was to present some of the conclusions that we have come to. We've prepared a document which is available on the site with a concept note with the 10 major proposals of our architecture chair with their rational underlying rational modus operandi, with the prospects for the way forward. Among these 4 proposals, for lack of time, we decided to choose 4 of these, which we will be focusing on tonight. One which echoes the meeting we had this morning with OIF and the Commonwealth about the reason and the modalities for taking into account the multidimensional vulnerability of countries in allocating the concessional funds, which is a discuss that has been much debated upon, but for which we have a strong and had a strong advocacy this morning from our honorable Louis Busicabo and Patrice Cotton, supported by the acting president of the African Union, the president of the Comores, and as well as Abdullah Yap, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Barbados. So perhaps to say what that implies from for multilateral banks to take into account this multidimensional vulnerability index in allocating the resources. The second point to be covered is support to private investment, for which I will ask Jean-Michel to tell us what is the content of the recommendation so that the panelists can react. The third proposal is the measures to be taken in the event of a natural shock, whether a natural disaster or economic, in particular the service of debt, for which we will listen to Bruno, who has authored a paper on this and moderated an event on this event. He will be presenting a conclusion on this third proposal. And the fourth proposal that had been tabled was to have a body to monitor financial flows to the south to see how compliant they were to the objective, in particular the fact that they be directed to the most vulnerable and poorest countries. That was a proposal initiated by Severino and Sylvia. A very important topic this morning in the opening speech. President Macron said tomorrow he would make proposals as to the follow-up of this summit. I made a comment earlier in an OECD event in Paris as the financial place, the center of the summit. Ventured thought that perhaps I would call upon a reform of the DAC committee of OECD, whether it is authorized to do so, perhaps its mandate should be broadened and its partnerships be strengthened. Competencies are there, but the legitimacy perhaps is missing still. So perhaps there is need to reform this body or create yet another institution. We had a discussion about this earlier in our discussions between President Macron, the President of the World Bank, and the head of IMF and the representative of the African Union. The question was about reforming, but the African representative said, but no, we need to create yet another body. So that's a whole discussion. So perhaps Jean-Michel could tell us a few words about this flagship proposal of support with the private sector. Thank you, Patrick, and good evening to all of you. I think this work on the private sector focused on two things that may seem contradictory, actually. One could be called from billions to trillions, and the other one that could be called from billions to millions. So billions to trillions, it means in all cases, we are talking here in the work concerning FERDI, we're talking about the funding of poor and fragile countries. Our topic was not Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, but rather Tanzania, Burkina Faso, or Papua Asia, New Guinea. So billions to trillions is the recognition, the acknowledgement that there's a massive infrastructure agenda in the poorest and most fragile countries whose satisfaction is intrinsic with the resolution of the problem of vulnerability, investment in adaptation, in social facilities, and so on. And this agenda cannot be addressed unless we acknowledge that the first and foremost problem is not the funding itself, but rather the proposal of quality project. In other words, money in theory, is there. Um, but the projects are struggling to emerge, and this is in particular linked to the difficulties of capacity of the administrations and public bodies to bring projects to the fore, but also, and that was underlined in the paper signed by Philippe Wehu, also related to the way the international institutions think and structure their public policy recommendations in this paper. We also insisted on the need to speed up the public policy reforms in the beneficiary countries because they govern the capacity of leveraging the private sector operations. But at the end of the day, this agenda seemed to us as something important to be carried, because to go from billions to trillions, the issue is not so much to initiate major reforms of the international scene, but rather to improve the intrinsic quality of the project generation process. The second topic is from billions to millions, and this is the topic of funding and support to the production system in Africa, SMEs, entrepreneurs, whose characteristic in terms of the financial mass are very small with respect to the financial amounts we're talking about. So that's the opposite approach. Rather than going to massive amounts of money, how can the billions already available be channeled and segmented into hundreds of thousand euros, and sometimes perhaps in microfinance a few hundreds euros, because the African production sector by nature and history is a very young system, very recent. Most of the African companies of 2050 are not in existence yet, so our challenge, the entrepreneurial system is there, but how can we help them come out of their workshop and to help them survive the valley of death entrepreneurship? And how can we help them speed up their growth when they have become more stable by funding through more capital, traditional capital tools, in a context where everybody acknowledges that the major problem is access of these entrepreneurs to technical human capacities and access to finance where which they are excluded from by virtue of the characteristics of the African financial market, but also because they are very small companies, and all countries of the world, the banking sectors and financial sectors do not fund this type of activity. So this second dimension led us to talk about to propose actually to develop a wide range of support mechanisms, from the densification of incubation activities and their acceleration, through the development of financial instruments at national level that would be liable to bring equity in small amounts to recent companies, and in their formalization process, all the way to developing instruments that, without going up to the amounts necessary to be profitable, would at least fill the missing middle, what we call the missing middle between the commercial market and the public subsidies.
All of this is an agenda that requires us to make money available, to capacity building, everything that costs money, everything to do with business acceleration and incubation, but also it requires monies, concessional funds, be they public origin or private origin through foundations, so as to be able to fill the gap that exists between economic profitability that's quite considerable for a certain business activity and financial profitability, which in most cases is not on a par with the expectations of the markets that traditional, conventional, mainstream investors are present on. So this has got to be borne in mind. These days, we have a new category, conceptual category, that's acknowledge, and we need blending therefore to be done. We need to make sure that the African productive sector that's so useful and developing strongly will be acknowledged as being conceptually legitimate. It's hard for it to wrap itself up right now because of budget availability, but also because of the distribution challenge for those monies and the way in which the monies percolate from the players right down to the companies themselves, the firms themselves. And we could highlight the question of DFIs, you know, or the SFIs of this world. And the thing is, here, this is a difficult issue to tackle because these DFIs seem to be a must as distributors and intermediaries in the distribution of these monies, but they weren't created for that purpose. These DFIs expect certain yields and volumes that are not consistent with the small volumes and the low levels of profitability of this African entrepreneurial universe. So we've got to plead in favor of a reform of DFIs. That's something that would warrant being debated upon thoroughly. But given, therefore, I'll conclude on this, given this big challenge ahead of us, we'll have to choose the right path forward for the international community. It'll be reforms, it'll be considerable reforms of the DFIs to enable them to finance not just African SMEs and startups, but in general, all the cause of working for the common good of general interest that we see on the table of discussions in the international community. Otherwise, we'll have to resign ourselves to create new instruments, and that's the debate you wanted to get going, Patrick. Reform of the system or create new instruments. That's what it'll be about, one or other of those. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jean-Michel. Now, to go through these four main proposals, but we don't want to rule out the other ones, of course, within our architecture. I'll ask Bruno Cabriac to talk a little bit about proposals concerning the conditional instruments to treat debt service issues. Bruno Cabriac. Thank you, Patrick. Welcome to Banque de France. If you're here physically with us in the room in person, the doors will be closed at 7 p.m., but after, well, they'll be closed a little bit after 7 o'clock, really, but please keep your badges and I'll show you the way out of here after 7 p.m. because the main doors will be closed. I'll bring you out the other door that we use after 7 p.m. So just wanted to make that housekeeping point first. So, this proposal regarding the fact of using conditional instruments a bit more, well, the context is fairly simple and straightforward. We've seen past shocks that were really substantial. There were three main ones: the major financial crisis we had, then COVID, and then the war in Ukraine. And these were shock waves and foreseeable ones, bigger and bigger ones because of natural disasters, because of global warming. So in this context, a certain amount of progress has been made, especially with the first three shocks I mentioned. We could mention the progress made by the IMF to set up instruments that are less conditional, with lightened conditionalities, fast tracking of the granting of loans, those to make such loans available to beneficiaries, to recipients for IMF funds. And you have the food shock window, which is a temporary thing, but that's there too. And the international institutions, especially the IMF, have actually made a lot of progress in responding rapidly when these shocks occur. It's important macroeconomically speaking to support states, but also to support companies and help companies or entrepreneurs to get through this valley of death that was just mentioned, and help them to withstand international storms that impact them heavily, especially the poorest and most vulnerable companies in the poorest and most vulnerable countries. So to act speedily, we've got to act with instruments that will have automatic rules. And we've seen already during the COVID crisis, an international initiative was set up to suspend the servicing of the debt. Went on for 18 months during the COVID crisis, but it took a while for it to be set up because we had to reach a consensus internationally on that. And the fact is that if we set up tools that, are conditional ones, we have to have sufficient consensus, because the problem about using these kind of tools, be it ex ante or ex post, is that you've got that critical mass. If you're the only one suspending the servicing of debt because the country has been affected by a particular shock, it won't make it possible for it to resolve its financing issues. So the idea is, once again, pretty simple. It's the agenda would be to have ex ante, upfront loan contracts that would encompass contingent clauses if there were to be a strong impact, a shock wave. And, the climate challenge is there. There's a probability of having natural disasters, especially the ones that would more particularly impact the most vulnerable countries, which often don't have the resources. They're private players, and we don't have the resources to obtain appropriate insurance, and the state authorities cannot do the reinsurance for those countries either. So it's important to at least lighten the servicing of the debt, to ease it up for those countries in times like that. It must be done multilaterally and within the context of public policies. Otherwise, it won't work. It will weigh upon the loans that integrate these suspension clauses for the most vulnerable countries. So this agenda has prospered quite a lot now. I think the summit has brought it forward quite a bit. These projects, defended by the British and supported a lot by the French state too, to bring in these loan clauses for poor and vulnerable countries, contingent measures, that is, for natural crisis. The English have announced that they would do it to secure their treasury loans for export guarantees. And this morning, we heard about the World Bank and the climate clauses that are built in systematically into their loan contracts. So the agenda on the ex ante instruments is making good progress. Now, on the ex post instruments, in the IMF, they've made a lot of progress already, but there is a problem of scaling it up. And we've got to go from billions to tens of billions in this case. And this problem of scaling it up is connected with the fact that the IMF loans, if there is a natural disaster, will be limited. And there are quotas and so on that apply. And we know that natural disasters can entail GDP losses that far exceed the limitations set down by the IMF instruments. So you need multilateral instruments that could be defended by the IMF, the World Bank, the bilateral donors too, an instrument that would be a purely contingent one. That is, that we'd have to agree at the international level about the rule that would trigger this measure. And that would be the thorniest problem to address, because once again, these instruments will be efficient only if they're automatic and if they have a wide scope. Otherwise, it'll just be, treading water, so to speak. So that is the agenda we're trying to bring forward. If you look at the climatic future we have ahead of us, it makes sense. It'll have to be done, and hopefully we will make progress on this. And I think the summit has helped us on quite a lot in that regard. Thank you, Mr. Guillemot. Just a couple of words to show you the consistency of all these proposals that do hang together in the chair in international architecture, development financing in FERDI. The first proposal I mentioned earlier could be tied into the one that Bruno Cabriac has just mentioned. He talked about the importance of having automatic contingent provisions in the event of a shock. We were thinking of climate shocks in particular, but it could be applied to other categories of exogenous shocks. In the first proposal that I presented earlier, the one that was the focus of our event this morning, well, the idea was to take account of the structural vulnerability of countries in the three dimensions, that is climatic, economic, and security-wise, in the allocation of concessional funds. This is a different kind of process. It won't take the place of what we just talked about, but it could be a good fit with it. It could be quite complementary and take account of vulnerability in allocation so as to try and be preventive rather than curative and help countries to build up some resilience for themselves to withstand these shocks that are probable, that are likely to happen. Haven't taken place, but that are quite likely to take place. We know from records that there is a danger they will actually occur. So you've got both. You need both. I mean, you've got to use both. You need allocation as a function of vulnerability to pursue a policy to build up resilience that's preventive, and that's why you have the mitigation credits that would be a function of vulnerability to climate change, and then you have after the event or ex ante action that can be taken, as Bruno Cabriac was saying, that's quite complementary with the first. So in the presentation to support the private sector, Jean-Michel Severino also showed the importance of specific support measures to SMEs and entrepreneurs, which will be complementary to measures we might enact to provide financing of large-scale investments. So I think that given those proposals that have been made, and we'll hark back to the one concerning the monitoring of financial flows, no doubt in a short while. I think Jean-Michel will be speaking again on that point. But we're very lucky to have with us, the Under-Secretary General of the United Nations with us, person from DESA by my side. And we heard this morning from the General Secretary of the United Nations, who talked about an in-depth reform of the international financial system from this standpoint, in center stage in the United Nations, but it can't be separated out from the debate within the Bretton Woods institutions. And that's why it's important for us to hear the reaction of NDESA regarding these proposals. And I'll give you the floor, sir, Mr. Junhua, and then we'll hear from Fatoumata Ba, who might like to react on the topic of private financing or anything else. And then we have Daouda Semben, who is a major expert in concerning Africa. So we haven't got Masoud Ahmed with us, unfortunately. He was hoping to be with us via Zoom from Washington, but unfortunately he's running a high temperature and he couldn't attend, unfortunately. He's indisposed. And we wish him a speedy recovery. And we also have the defection, the Minister of the Economy and Finance from the Comoros, Mr. Nze, who had to go to hospital this morning. Whereas I talked to him on the phone yesterday and he was getting ready to speak to us. And we were happy to have him. And also there's somebody else. Has anybody had news of Mr. Shah, who is the Director General of the Arab Bank for Economic Development in Africa, the BADIA? Perhaps he's attending online. So you have the floor, sir.
Merci. I'm sorry that I can't speak French. So with your permission, could I just make a few remarks in another foreign language to me, and I guess it's also to you. I guess today we gathered here. The very theme that we want to elaborate, that is how we could secure sustaining financing for after this summit, even for the coming years or decade. I guess all of you perhaps heard very clearly and loudly what the leaders and my Secretary General has elaborated this morning and this afternoon. So probably I could just briefly share some of the UN observations or perspectives on a number of issues, particularly the 4 recommendations being discussed at this side event. All of you that understood that this year actually marks the midpoint for the implementation of the 2030 agenda. And leaders are going to meet in New York in coming September to conduct their review, halfway review. But very, very unfortunately, I need to be very honest with you. The water is nearing from the impact of the conference of global shocks. Just now I heard COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine, climate change, and perhaps a few other things. We all witnessed the high energy and the food prices and the rapid tightening financial conditions. All those have exacerbated the challenges for developing countries, particularly for those most vulnerable countries. And over the past several years, poverty and hunger are on the rise rather than decline. And the threat of the debt distress is looming over too many countries. Altogether, there would be about more than 50 countries are either in the debt distress or are about to experience the debt distress. So on the top, there's the climate emergency. That is inflicting the most harm to the most vulnerable populations. But having said that, we do have that very bleaking picture. But having said that, what we can recognize, what we can reconcile with each other, that is the sustainable development goals still remain our best way out of this crisis and towards a more resilient future. Otherwise, what kind of the roadmap or what kind of the plan of action we could concentrate on, we can focus on. So that's why the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, has put forward a number of proposals to massively boost the financing for investment in the SDGs. So that I guess you probably heard it among all those proposals put forward by the Secretary General. The number one we always focused on, we call it SDG stimulus or SDG stimulus plan, which calls on international community to raise at least $500 billion per year to scale up the financing for countries in need. And then actually in this plan or in this stimulus plan, we called 3 priority areas. Number one, to tackle the high cost of debt. Number two, to scale up the affordable long-term financing for countries in need, and particularly through the strengthened or informed MDBs. We would put more focus, more priorities on MDBs. And third, to expand the contingency financing. In addition to that, the Secretary General also put forward in his policy brief to reform the international financial architecture or existing international financial architecture, because we simply believe the existing architecture, the existing system does not meet its mandate, does not meet what expectations are from the member states, particularly from the developing world. And in our policy brief, we outlined a number of recommendations, many of which aligned with the 4 areas under discussion today. And of course, in line very much with the UN ongoing work. First, UN has been advancing work on multidimensional vulnerability, including through the multidimensional vulnerability index, which the UN has initiated, has established a high-level panel working on this. We call it MVI, which we hope by the coming September or October the General Assembly of the United Nations can adopt this new platform, which could be used by MDB when they reassess the request from the member states, from the developing countries, to use this as additional platform, additional to or complementary to GNI or GNP. And we strongly urge the MDB to build on and be coherent with the work in UN on vulnerability system, on vulnerability measures to reduce the duplication. Because now it seems that MDBs and UN work on a different direction. We want to see a more coherent collaboration among those entities. Second, on encouraging and incentivizing private investment, UN actually has been publishing a report we call it the Financing for Sustainable Development Report. That report actually highlighted the importance of supporting countries in building strong and dynamic domestic private sector. Domestic private sector is a driving force in any of the member states to accelerate the implementation of a 2030 agenda and also to accomplish the recovery from the pandemic. But leveraging international private finance also has a potential to accelerate the domestic growth and the international growth. But however, up to date, blended finance has been very, very minimum. I can give you just a very alarming figure. Least developed countries, LDC, received only about 15% of the total blending finance. The development impact of the blended finance deals is also unknown due to the weak monitoring and reporting. We don't have the data about the blended financing. And in this context, we need a new framework for blended finance. It is thus very important that the indicators and the incentives called for the MDB vision statement to be emerged from this Paris Finance Summit will focus on sustainable development impacts as well as quantity. We want to see the private financing not only will be measured by quantity, but also measured by its impact. Third, we are very heartened by the progress made on the climate resilient debt process. For that, I don't need to further elaborate. Finally, on monitoring financial flows to the south, that is illicit flow. The UN Statistical Commission has adopted a new indicators for SDG target 17.3 last year. These indicators are aimed to mobilize additional financial resources for developing countries from multiple resources. At the same time, the UN Statistical Commission has also underscored that it is important to distinction between the flows that have a different impacts on development, because different flows will be reported separately and not in the same manner or in aggregated. So to recap briefly, issues being discussed today are pressing priorities in the work of the United Nations. The UN Secretary General has put forward a set of the ambitious proposals. First, to raise the resources. Second, to reform the international financial architecture. We look forward to continuing these discussions as SDG Summit and the high-level dialogue on the financing for development at the UN, both back-to-back the incoming September. I thank you so much for your attention.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Secrétaire Général Adjoint. It's very important for us to have
It's very important for us to have such a strong support from you and the UN to the recommendation made by our group for the preparation of the summit, and we are all looking forward, and I do hope that this recommendation, those which could not be implemented just tomorrow, will be more and more considered in the next weeks. Thank you so much. Alors peut-être Fatoumata, quelques mots sur, je vois que malheureusement le temps passe.
Fatoumata, I see time is passing on. We'll give you the floor straight away. We would like to hear from you. Mr. Ta hasn't joined us, is that correct? Okay. Well, we're short of time. Okay. Patrick, thank you very much, says Fatoumata Ba. I think what's been said sufficiently in the last few days is that Africa is indeed a whole set of challenges for mankind. We've got economic emergencies to deal with, we've got climate emergencies, and we've got the fact that it's a learning lab to find solutions for the rest of the world too. And in the last few years, I've been working on these themes, and I can testify to that. I can give you concrete examples of how African entrepreneurs are using technology to pick up 4 gauntlets and react to the proposals that have been made to speed up their impact. Now, firstly, African entrepreneurs have a key role to play because they need to utilize technology to foster access to products, key staple products for as many people as possible, health and everything else. And in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, Senegal, I'm from Senegal myself, we've got just about 20% of the population that can have a traditional bank account. And at the same time, in Kenya, there are 93% of Kenyans who have a subscription to a mobile financial service, so that more than 50% of the GDP goes through such devices. So that is an example of financial inclusion, and it's become an example in terms of global success. And we can also assert the need to help SMEs. These are the lungs of real economy. SMEs, and an investor partner in the room has, and John Go, supported a Nigerian entrepreneur who a couple of years ago set up a platform making it possible for small grocers, mom and pop stores as they're often called, to access quality brands at best possible prices. Now, it's a platform that has a volume of annual transactions of more than $1 billion US, because there are more than 100,000 grocers who use it. And apart from the online market, that's accessible to them, they can bring down their overheads, make them more competitive, and they can obtain financing because it gives them a good track record, economically speaking, on the platform, so that they can do credit scoring and they will be financeable. You know, startups or trusted third parties who have banking interest. Also, it shows they can utilize technology to pick up the employment challenge for investments. We've seen in Django that you can create direct and indirect jobs, derived jobs, jobs that are spin-offs. In Django, we measure internal rate of return, for example, and also we measure the impact in terms of the social returns for each euro or dollar invested. So that gives us a multiple impact. It's like a leverage effect. It can multiply by 5 the impact of an initiative taken. And also, entrepreneurs in Africa are using technology to pick up the climate challenges. 3 years ago, investment was done in a startup in Senegal. It's doing something very simple. It helps fleet managers to totally digitalize the management of their fleet of vehicles, be they small traders or big industries, and they bring down their costs. That means they make them more competitive, and on average, their carbon footprint goes down by 30%. So, it's the triple bottom line, as we call it. So we were very proud to support them from the very start. And this startup has left our country now. It's gone to 8 other countries in French-speaking Africa and English-speaking Africa too. They're gone to Tanzania too. And they have acquired their first French clients recently too. So that's a very good example of reverse innovation. Sometimes Africa, it's thought, will replicate examples from elsewhere in the world, but I see every single day that goes by that there are fantastic entrepreneurs meeting African challenges that can be regional ones, not just African ones, or even global challenges. And there is this amazing contrast between all of this swarming of bright ideas and the financing available. Now, if you look at venture capital in innovation, that's really my core business, it's about 1% of global financing. That's 17% of the population. The biggest challenge is we only attract 1% of venture capital. That is really a major issue that we must address. I totally subscribe to the proposal to accelerate investment in entrepreneurs via private financing. Of course, you've got to encompass all of the value chain. It's 1%, the 1% even that's available is very badly distributed, unevenly distributed. Historically, there are 4 countries which up to 2 years ago focused on about 90% of the value of investments: Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya, and South Africa. But entrepreneurship is a major driver for development, and it's even more important in more fragile countries, I'd say. The second disparity that's important is in terms of industrial sectors. If you're in financial services or agriculture, you can raise funds, and we know the challenges are very bigger in health and education and so on. So another third challenge mentioned by Jean-Michel is the value chain of venture capital as a whole. It's a bit more mature downstream than upstream. If you look at private equity funds and so on, and the players that will support entities. So, it's fine to end up being IPO'd and so on, and, have a success story to tell. But sometimes you need seed money to go from an idea to innovation and then real growth, and have a chance to become a champion. That's where we need to put in the seed money, because 70% of startups in the world go by the board within 2 or 3 years, as somebody mentioned. There's the valley of death to go through, and so we've got to provide them with the seed money necessary to get them through that valley of death after 2 or 3 years. And we can't but take account of all this attrition that's going on. So we must mobilize people on financing at the very start of the value chain, because with the Django and other entities, we're working on that, but not enough work is done on it yet. Another problem of disparity that is key as well is that Africa is a continent where you have the most women entrepreneurs, 27% in total. Ghana has the most. These are official figures that come out every year, but we've got $42 billion worth of a shortfall of investment. So it's a moral issue. And if you look at McKinsey's studies, they state very clearly that if we get to gender equality in economic activity in Africa, it's $300 billion US dollars worth of additional GDP. So it's massive in importance, colossal in importance. So we need innovative mechanisms. With Jean-Michel, we talk about fund of funds. That was one of the proposals, a flagship proposal by the chair that could perhaps channel these investments, but we need to go even further, I think, and act on different topics. One topic is in international investors in Africa, apart from financing development, that's covered by already existing entities. We need business investments to be done, and you've got to exercise some impact on people's perception of risk, and then act on the real risk, not just the perception, but first loss initiatives and so on, so as to massively fund African startup companies and entrepreneurs. And also got to stimulate local financing. Give people some glimmer of hope. In Egypt, for example, there's an Egyptian central bank that's incentivized local banks to invest in venture capital funds. And thanks to that, the most recent fund from Sabari from Egypt raised 50% of the size of funds with 4 local banks in local currency. So these are just a few pointers I wanted to give you just to feed into the debate here.
The last two speeches were quite complimentary. The point of view of the United Nations with the major problems at planet level and in their implementation for the poorer and vulnerable countries, and the point of view of the field with a very innovative entrepreneur that underlines the general problems that the summit should address. So thank you for this. And now we listen to Daoud Hassan, who is another voice of Africa, but also familiar with financial international institutions. Thank you, Patrick, and good evening, Joel. It's great when we are in the panel like this, when you come with us. Everything has been said, so I just need to concur with what was said before. So thank you. In fact, we would ask to react to the 4 proposals of the chair. First of all, I would like to commend FERDI for this very enlightening research work. I follow your work and it's always very insightful. I'd say, first of all, that the first proposal related to private investment, which Fatima covered with Michel. So I think it's easy to support this proposal because it's very important in reducing poverty and vulnerability to ensure that private investment be developed in these countries. But the question of blending that we heard from Michel is key. But however, we should remember what Mr. Li Junhua said, that when you look at the blended financial flows to less developed countries, we're talking about 15% of the total available. So there's an effort to be made to simulate this kind of blended funding to developing countries, in particular in Africa, where it's very important. Another important question is to reform MDEBs so that their contribution in terms of developing the private sector through landed funding, but also guarantees and risk mitigation mechanisms to be improved. And that's the very aim, I think, or interest of this Paris summit. So that's for the first proposal. The second proposal, I'd like to react about the importance of the shocks that occur and how to react. We all see the relevance of this proposal. What I could add is that what we oftentimes see is that the most vulnerable countries in terms of climate change and shocks, most of the time is the problem of liquidity. Is when they are hit by one of these shocks and they struggle to get access to liquidity. This liquidity crisis may result in solvency crisis and in turn in a debt crisis. So it's important to have mechanisms that make it possible whenever there is a shock that is incurred that they can allocate the resources available to actions to face up to these shocks rather than be caught by the servicing of the debt. So it's important to have these clauses included in the arrangements, and we are quite happy about the momentum that has been seen in many countries for these clauses to be included in the financing and debt contract. As one of the panelists suggested, this type of incentive should be automatic. We need to ensure that it is the case, but also it should be appropriate. Let me give you an example of the rapid credit facility, which Bruno mentioned at IMF. In fact, is a great facility because for fragile countries and those with low income, they can get access to this without conditionality. But it's this facility originally, when it was set up, access to funding was capped to 25% under this system. 25% of the quota of the country, and these countries have usually very low quota. So when you say 25% of funding, it's better than nothing, perhaps, but most of the time it's not enough to even have minimum impact. If I refer to what the Prime Minister of Barbados said concerning Caribbean countries, she estimated that the impact of shocks and stand in responding to these shocks on the impact on the debt was over 50%. The total increase in the debt of these countries. So we're talking about very big volumes, big amounts of money. So, but I think we really need to work on what these for these countries to get better resources when they're affected. The third proposal is that of the chair, that is to set up a organization to monitor financial flows to the south. Perhaps this could be discussed further. We haven't heard from the chair what they thought about this proposal. It could be on the face of it interesting, but my question was, what happens when this monitoring body evaluates the report and realizes that the financials are not compliant with the objectives either in terms of vulnerability or poverty? What can this body do in actual fact? It's important to know it, because if the mandate of the body is just to say it's compliant or not compliant, and there's no binding action that can be taken from this, or no authority, I think it will limit the benefit of this proposal. It's interesting, but it needs more clarification, and perhaps we lack the time to talk about this, but it would be interesting to delve into. Let me give you an example. Recently in the press, there was coverage about the World Bank that would have projects that were labeled climate change project that were not really about climate change. So there's a monitoring action needed to ensure that what is labeled climate change is indeed climate change, so that we know what is a climate change project and what is not a climate change project. So this would need expertise, and it would be important to have if this were be done. And my last point, and about the last proposal, which is quite dear to me, the proposal of whether we should take into account, beside the income, the multidimensional value rated for the allocation of concessional funds. I think clearly it is a proposal that is in line with the request made to MDB to focus more on public goods when we are shifting from a poverty-only approach by the World Bank, and you look at the vulnerability of climate change or other challenges in terms of fragility, etc. It is quite fair that in this case you be able to allocate concessional funds not based on their income but on their vulnerability. And I fully agree that we should look at multidimensional vulnerability. But the question is, and it certainly is something that has been tabled in many developing countries, they all agree on this, it's an excellent idea, but we need to make sure that this does not lead to other side effects, like the fact that MDB, such as the World Bank or other institutions, and under the excuse of addressing the climate-related issues, they would divert all their resources towards climate change actions rather than to poverty. I'm not saying that there's no interaction between the two. You see that it is the case, there is interaction, but sometimes there is a gap. And the question is, how can we make sure that vulnerability be taken in charge without it being at the expense of other challenges, whether it be poverty, fragility, or another important thing is to know that if we want to go in this direction, we should do so by increasing the funding capacity of MDBs and the institutions in charge of this. And this must be highlighted. The example of IMF is here. They have this resilience and sustainability facility that they set up with additional resources, because these resources come from the SDRs. They didn't use the PITT for this purpose. So that's perhaps the principle we should work on. We need these multilateral institutions to be invited to play this role, because countries need to be both advancing their agenda for the fight against poverty, but also against climate change, whether in mitigation or other. But for the MDBs and multilateral institutions to be able to support them, they need to have an increased funding capacity, so that not one agenda be advanced at the expense of another. Let me just say a few words before Mr. Li Chunhua leaves us, because he's to rejoin the Secretary General of the UN. Mr. Li Chunhua approved a number of proposals of FERDI. At the same time, he said he regretted that we didn't have time to cover the fourth proposal about the monitoring, and he gave us an example that there's a risk. Who is going to give instructions to MDBs as to their activities? And if at least we have a body, monitoring organization. Body.
We have the Development Cooperation Forum for Finance Investment, the partnership, global partnership, the DAC, and who will be competent and legitimate to assess the good orientation of the financial flows, public but also private, with regard to the SDGs. It may be the OECD, if reformed, enlarged with a stronger support with South countries, or do we need a special instance for that? It's a matter of thinking within the chair, and we have not the conclusion presently. But it's a question which is on the table. And the President Macron this morning said that we should have tomorrow a follow-up of the conclusion of the summit. Who will follow up? Thank you. Please, if you.
This is a good question and a complicated question. Personally, I believe this job cannot be done by a single unit or single organization, either by World Bank or OECD or United Nations. But I would suggest we need to have a task force, because World Bank, OECD, IMF do have their own expertise and data. UN also has our own data based on the the official data we collected from the member states. And I personally believe perhaps we need to establish a task force among the agencies, and perhaps also plus some other MDBs, new MDBs like Islamic development banks or the other regional development banks. This is a joint effort, as you said, it's a partnership, it's coordination and collaboration. I personally, I'm more optimistic to see that monitoring, reporting, and reviewing will be done by a joint task force rather than by a single entity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good, very good point, and a matter for new thinking and research, and for the think tank and the policy makers. Thank you very much.
Sorry about it, but I have to run. Thank you.
Peut-être, je pensais que Olivier Lafourcade voudrait dire quelques mots.
I think Olivier Lafourcade wanted to say a couple of words here on all these topics. Is that correct? And we'll wind it up fairly quickly after that. If there are questions in the room or online, we'll try and take them. So, yes, thank you. Yes, indeed. Thank you. Very briefly. First of all, congratulations to the panelists. You've broached a huge, broad spectrum of the problems at hand. However, my appetite was whetted, but not satisfied with the dichotomy we sometimes see between rationalization, in particular at macroeconomic levels, macro-institutional levels, and then the realities out on the ground. Obviously, I tend to defend the point of view of the people in the field because that's where I spent most of my career. But I feel that the reality we have, there's a lead lag effect, between the reality and the major orientations being sketched out. It's conceptual, strategic, and so on. But it's got to be reflected in practice out on the ground. And along with the chair, we've been talking about all these topics. But current day reality, unfortunately, if you look at what's going on around us, people say, show me the results, show me the outcomes. And in many fields, either there's confusion, or else there's ambivalence, or else there's a lead lag effect. If you take a few examples, there's lots of money available, it's said. When you look at the difference between the commitments and the actual cash out, how is it possible that there should be such a difference? Look at the allocation mechanism. All the criteria you mentioned are indeed just as valid still, or even more valid. And I'm happy to see that the criterion of vulnerability is starting to be factored in. It should have been around for ages already. In any case, in spite of this, in the allocation mechanisms, we see practices by the institutions, be they private, public, or commercial or not. It's quite contradictory what's going on. Look at health. The tens of institutions taking care of health, financing health, and it's totally disorganized out on the ground. So there's this lead lag phenomenon. Now, the proposals that I think are really worthwhile on all the topics we've mentioned, that's where this begs the question, what's the commonality that we can have between the different partners? There are a few examples that reiterate this because it struck me like the example in Burkina Faso, going back to the 1990s with a general representation of civil society and all the partners in the country. A strategy has to be set up. It's the country that did the strategy. It's nobody else's position. Now, I'm wondering, I mentioned as a concrete case, those two instruments I thought were absolutely key. On the one hand, have the public expenditure review, and then on the other hand, the mapping of poverty in the country. And if you put the two together with the contribution from outside, there's a huge discrepancy. Why not use these instruments as a common basis for the private sector and the public sector, and also the foundation and the civil society at large. So there are all these examples. There are very interesting examples mentioned about contingent financing. But I remember Mexico at the end of the 1990s, where they created, with the support of the bank, and I got criticized in the bank because of that, the creation of a fund for natural disasters. It's still there. It's called the Fund In. The principle was exactly that, to put contingent financing up. And at the time, the bank said, no, we can't do that. But the Mexicans did it all along. Now, has it been replicated elsewhere? Well, to my knowledge, no. Not globally and systematically anyway. So there are new proposals. I mean, it's 30 years we've been working on this kind of thing. So, it's all about doing. It's all in the doing. And there are all sorts of problems we've already singled out a long time ago, and solutions have been found for them. But Fatoumata mentioned the concrete cases that she's seen. How can we leverage on the experience? It's all about scaling it up, going to scale, bringing it to scale. And in my opinion, then it's a question of institutions, mechanisms, and behavior patterns and procedures that are totally contradictory. They're all at odds with each other very often. Thank you. Thank you, Olivier. You've all understood that what Olivier Lefourcade said in a way were some conclusions after another event we had recently on conditionality issues and buy-in, taking ownership and local process and so on. And I'd refer you to the document that he published himself on the site regarding that we couldn't address in more detail. But thank you indeed for taking the floor and making those important points on the basis of the work we've done. Can we take any questions from the room? I wonder, have we got time? But if there's nobody, there's somebody on the rostrum actually who has a question. Michel, you have the floor. Yes. As time is passing, and we can't really comment on, you can't comment on what I might say, so I don't want to say something that, that will create shockwaves. Between 1960 and 1980, we went through a period of economic expansion that was quite substantial, with lots of transfers of money to Africa. And then we had the debt crisis. Structural adjustment, well, it took us 20 years to address that. And then for 20 years, we went into a cycle from 2000 to 2020 that looked like the period between 1960 and 1980. And then we came back to an over-indebtedness crisis for the African continent. And what I'm hearing now is exactly what I heard in 1980. Let's cancel the debt and let's start to finance again. So I would suggest that we should do some soul searching about the repetition of this cycle. And our current discourse, firstly, hopefully we will address the over-indebtedness problem faster than what we did in the 1980s. We might only take 10 years to get to 20, I mean. But it took us 20 years to get there. Now, if we resolve that crisis, let's not make all the same mistakes all over again. And, we're getting ready to address the crisis of the debt in 2040. I mean, it's pathetic, isn't it? So, what's subtending all this is that we're financing the African continent badly. We're doing a bad job. The African continent needs savings rates, investment rates that will be higher to achieve faster growth. But we're calling on the multilateral development banks to help us out there. They lend money to Africa. But most of the African countries that are poor need donations, money to be given to them. So, there's private financing as well, but public financing is done. It should be in the form of donations. And this is a topic that most governments are sketching out in their own minds, because public development aid, official development aid went down the last years, and African subjects African countries are starting to think about this too. I was stupefied to see that they're talking about reinforcing the loans from multilateral development banks that are running counter to their interests, are totally against all their interests. And they're starting to say that. and look at the financial discipline that we need. There's no chance of getting out of this over-indebtedness situation if China doesn't join up with the private and public creditors and impose discipline jointly to fight against this over-indebtedness problem. I mean, we would be shouting and screaming if microfinance players were going to small borrowers and demolishing their efforts to drive down their over-indebtedness problem. We've got to have collective discipline. China and the big emerging countries will have to become part of this collective discipline effort. And also, we need a common agreement on the quality of investments. Because in the end of the day, what's the issue, financially speaking, is that the quality of the investment that's financed by all of this assistance is too low. It doesn't generate growth rates that would be sufficient to cushion against the indebtedness problem. So you've got borrowers and creditors, you've got recipients and donors who must all agree on the quality of investment and say what kind of investment will generate growth rates of 8, 9, 10% per annum that the African continent needs to absorb the demographic growth that's at 2.5. So I just want to wind it up because a lot of people might get indignant, but we need to address these hard topics to address because most of the solutions put on the table right now will bring us just up to a phase where we'll be preparing the over-indebtedness crisis of the African continent in 2040.
Thank you for this powerful message, which should be our food for thought. You must have heard in Perseverance's words, he's been very much involved in this chair for the international funding of development. And in this process, we're not trying to avoid the problems, to shun the problems, rather to anticipate. And it's true that the focus of the international discussion on debt is a bit concerning about the future. However, it is a fact, it is a problem that needs to be addressed, but we need to bear in mind the lessons of history and ask ourselves why the same causes are resulting in the same effects. It's a very important problem. Bruno has a few words to say, and perhaps I will leave the hand over to Jean-Sébastien Collin, who is the Undersecretary of Multilateral Help, who has joined us, and it will be for me a good opportunity to thank his ministry and the Ministry of Economy and Finance, French Ministry, in running this initiative. Just a few words, because you said you thought you would be allowed to take the floor. I would like to concur with what you just said, Samuel, because at the end of this day, like many times is the case about funding development, I'm struck by a number of contradictions. First, a contradiction of figures. We have needs that are expressed in trillions. We have ambitions expressed in hundreds of billions, and we have realities that are expressed in dozens of billions. I heard that Mr. Linchua mentioned 500 billion of additional credit for development banks, and what will produce the reform over 10 years, the current reform in the current state of the development banks is 50 billion. So there's a huge contradiction in numbers, and that's the problem. And the risk is that we will end up with over-indebtedness crisis or strong disappointments. The second contradiction is between the macroeconomic narrative, which is rather anxiogenic, and with crises, needs that are not met, objectives of sustainable development that will never be achieved, and time lost, and so on. and the microeconomic narrative, which is one with nice stories, as you told us, where we see solutions in the field that things are doable and not necessarily that costly. So you tend to think, are we going to repeat our mistakes of the past, or find other ways to fund the private sector? And perhaps the private sector can continue to develop within adverse macroeconomic context. Perhaps we can trust African entrepreneurs. And the third contradiction is one between the world public goods and development, in particular between climate and development, as we heard from Daouda. We must, sometimes there are trade-offs to be made, but there's a whole discourse that refuses to look at this and see what it means of these trade-offs in terms of the focus on the most vulnerable countries, because we arbitrate for a quick transition based on the reduction of emissions in emerging countries. This is where we need to focus the funding efforts, which will be done whether we like it or not, at the expense of the most vulnerable countries. So there are many contradictions in all these discussions. And I believe that what needs to be done beyond the prescriptive approaches to face reality and not always overly focus on these contradictions, which are a source of anxiety. Thank you, Bruno. Two points. It's not enough to say, oh, it's the same struggle, climate and poverty reduction. There are points of convergence, but there are also choices to be made. So I refer you back to the document written by Sylviane, Jean-Michel, and another document about major trade-offs of the system. We need to look at them straight in the eye to act as efficiently as possible, and to how these decisions are made. Well, to understand that you need to look at the flows and what is happening in reality. Hence, the need for an evaluation body. I was struck earlier on. There was a meeting with OECD, Paris as the think tank locus for financial flows and monetary and so on, and OECD announcing we have increased aid to development. Okay, but we have reduced it for the poor countries in Africa because we diverted money to help Ukraine. Oh, very well, but who is courageous enough to say that the flows have diminished for these countries? So we need to have a pluralistic body, and the question remains open. So thank you for your help, Jean-Sébastien. A word of conclusion, perhaps? No, I don't have. I mean, it was a very interesting day, and thank you for your input. The President of the French Republic, in his introduction, mentioned the four aims of this. I mean, no opposition between poverty, struggle against poverty and climate change. The fact that every country should choose their own way towards this, the fact that for the international community, there's a need to find a kind of financial shock, both private and public, and we need to mobilize the private sector tomorrow. In the conclusion phase of the summit, the President will perhaps tell us more about this. But I would like to extend my warmest thanks to FERDI for their exceptional work over the last few months, because you have heard this morning, those who attended the meeting in Poignard this evening, you have contributed to the work of the summit and also to our own work for the interministerial work for development. So thank you very much to all of you. Thank you.
Oui, monsieur.
Vous avez un micro, sinon on peut pas vous voir. Merci beaucoup de me donner la parole.
Thank you for giving me. I'll be very brief. First of all, to thank FERDI for their work. It's been a number of years. I've been invited to follow your work, and I would just like to concur with 2 points that were raised. First, that all the actions taken in terms of strategic analysis are fully discrepancy with the reality of the field, and what the Fatima said is quite true. It's important that the leading bodies that make the decision listen to the field. Today, everything we're talking about financing Africa, it's all very well. Public financing is all very well. But I think there are things that have been left aside that could be a real lever. Everybody here would agree that the financial budgets sent to by immigrants are greater than public aid that is assigned to the state. But anybody here who goes and sees a banker to say, I need money for investing, the first question is, what do you have? Do you start from what you have to be given more, to do more? And those who send money back to Africa who are here, they have wealth, but they cannot use it to invest. So I would like to take this opportunity to have someone from the Ministry of the Economy and Finance to thank you for saying that when you send money and that it's straight, you can claim this for your taxes. It's a very good thing, but you can go one step further to precisely allow the African diaspora, which is a great advantage that Europe has and China doesn't have. Let's rely on this to have real development, because those of the diaspora who invest in Africa, most of the time, they know about the reality of the field. Thank you, and believe me, I am a farmer. I grew up in Burkina Faso. I know the field, and I'm really passionate about IT, so I am quite good at interpreting numbers too. Thank you. So perhaps that was something missing in our discussion. So thank you for adding this to our discussion. Now, if we don't want to be locked at the Banque de France and spend the night here, we should now follow Bruno Cabria, leaders. And please do keep your passion. It will be important in going through the various locks. Otherwise, you'll be locked in the vault. Thank you. This is all for today. The interpreters bid farewell.